My parents testified against me, under oath. They said I forged everything. The jury stared at me like I was some kind of criminal. I didn't defend myself. I didn't say a single word. Because I knew something they didn't. Their lawyer froze when the judge leaned forward and said calmly, "Bring in the witness." For a moment, the entire courtroom went silent. You could hear the faint hum of the old fluorescent lights above us, the kind that always seemed to buzz louder when people stopped breathing. My mother lowered her eyes. My father tightened his grip on the wooden railing in front of him. And I stood there, perfectly still. After 20 years serving in the Navy, learning to stay calm under pressure had become second nature to me. But nothing in my life had ever prepared me for this moment. Because the people sitting across that courtroom weren't strangers. They were my parents. The courthouse in Fairfax County wasn't anything fancy. Red brick outside, beige walls inside, old benches polished smooth by decades of worried hands. I had walked through those doors before, but never like this. Never as the defendant. The morning air had been cool when I stepped out of my car. Early fall in Virginia. The kind of crisp morning where the trees are just beginning to turn orange. For most people, it was just another Tuesday. For me, it was the day my life might fall apart. When I walked into the courtroom, the first thing I saw was my mother. She looked smaller than I remembered. Age had curved her shoulders. Her once dark hair had turned silver. She sat beside my father, clutching her purse with both hands. Neither of them looked at me. That hurt more than anything the prosecutor would say later. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 62 years old. And until 6 months ago, I thought my parents trusted me. The judge entered the room and everyone stood. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor echoed through the courtroom. I stood, 2 hands folded in front of me, the same way I had stood during countless military briefings over the years. I served 21 years in the United States Navy. Most of that time I worked in intelligence supporting SEAL operations overseas. Afghanistan, Iraq, places where decisions had consequences measured in seconds and lives. You learn discipline in the military. You learn patience. And you learn how to wait. That last lesson was the one carrying me through this trial. Because while everyone else in that room believed a story about me, I knew the truth. The prosecutor began outlining the case. According to the documents presented, I had forged corporate records in order to illegally transfer ownership shares of my family's company. The company was called Carter Defense Systems. My grandfather started it in 1968, building radio equipment for Navy ships. Over the decades, it had grown into a major defense contractor. Satellite communications, secure military networks, government contracts worth billions. On paper, my parents still controlled the majority of the company. But after my grandfather passed away, there were complicated trust agreements regarding future ownership. That's where the accusation started. According to the prosecution, I had altered the trust documents to give myself control of nearly $5 billion in company shares. $5 billion. The number sounded unreal every time someone said it out loud. I didn't need $5 billion. I had a military pension, a modest home near Annapolis, and a life I was proud of. But the jury didn't know me. To them, I was just another corporate executive accused of fraud. The prosecutor called the first witness, my father. I felt something tighten in my chest as he walked to the stand. He raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. I had watched that same man teach me how to ride a bicycle, help me with algebra homework, stand in the driveway when I left for Navy boot camp. And now he sat 10 feet away from me, testifying that I had betrayed him. She manipulated the documents, he said, his voice rough but steady. I trusted her because she's my daughter, but what she did, it wasn't right. Every word landed like a weight on my chest. My lawyer leaned toward me. "Emily, we can challenge this during cross-examination," he whispered. I shook my head slightly. Not yet. Because anger would only make things worse, and the truth didn't need anger. The prosecutor then called my mother. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "I never believed Emily would do something like this," she said softly. "But the records, they show her signature." I closed my eyes for a moment. They truly believed it. That realization hurt far more than the accusations themselves. Somewhere along the way, someone had convinced them I was capable of destroying our family. When their testimony ended, the prosecutor presented the documents. Printed emails, digital authorization logs, trust amendment forms with my name on them. To anyone looking at them for the first time, the evidence seemed convincing. The jury studied the papers carefully. Several of them glanced in my direction. Curious. Suspicious. Trying to decide who I was. My lawyer stood. Your Honor, the defense requests a brief recess. The judge nodded. 15 minutes. People began leaving the room. Conversations filled the hallway outside. My lawyer turned toward me. Emily, you need to explain something, he said quietly. If you didn't alter those documents, we have to prove it. I know, I said calmly. He frowned. You don't seem worried. I'm not. He stared at me for a moment. Why? I folded my hands together just like I had during countless military debriefings. Because the truth is about to walk through that door. Back inside the courtroom, the jury returned to their seats. My parents sat quietly on the opposite side of the room. My mother finally glanced toward me. Our eyes met for just a second. There was confusion in hers. Pain, too. I wished I could tell her everything right then. But timing matters. Especially in court. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked over the case file. Then he spoke. Counsel, the court has been notified of a new witness arriving. The prosecutor looked surprised. My lawyer simply nodded. I remained silent, because I had been waiting months for this moment. The judge tapped his pen lightly against the bench. Bring in the witness. When the judge said, bring in the witness, the courtroom doors hadn't opened yet. The bailiff stepped out to the hallway to escort whoever it was inside, and for a brief moment everything paused. The jury shifted in their seats. Papers rustled. My father cleared his throat. I sat there quietly, hands folded on the table, waiting. But the story of how I got to that chair, accused by my own parents of forging documents worth billions, didn't start in that courtroom. It started more than 40 years earlier. Back in 1981, in a modest brick house outside Norfolk, Virginia. My father had been a Navy engineer then, working long hours at the shipyard. My mother taught 4th grade at a public school a few miles away. We weren't wealthy. Not even close. But we had something that mattered more in those days: stability. My father believed in discipline. My mother believed in patience. Between the two of them, I grew up learning that responsibility wasn't optional, it was expected. The Carter Defense Systems Company existed back then, but it was nothing like what it would eventually become. My grandfather ran it out of a converted warehouse near the docks. They built communications equipment for naval vessels, radios, encrypted transmitters, simple hardware that sailors depended on when storms knocked out standard signals. I spent a lot of afternoons there as a teenager. The warehouse always smelled faintly of solder and machine oil. Granddad would sit me on a stool next to his workbench and explain things in the careful, steady voice of a man who believed knowledge should be passed down slowly. Good equipment saves lives, he used to say. Never forget that. I didn't. By the time I graduated high school in 1982, the Navy felt like the natural path for me. My parents weren't surprised when I enlisted. My mother cried, of course. But my father simply nodded. Serve well, he told me. And I did. Boot camp at Great Lakes was the first real test. Cold mornings. Long drills. Constant pressure. But the military suited me. I discovered something about myself during those early years. I had a calm mind under stress. While others panicked, I focused. That quality eventually pushed me toward intelligence work. By the early 1990s, I was stationed overseas supporting operations connected to special warfare units, including SEAL teams operating in unstable regions. My job wasn't glamorous. No movie-style heroics. Mostly analysis. Satellite reports. Encrypted transmissions. Threat assessments. But the information we handled mattered. Sometimes lives depended on it. I served through multiple deployments. Through wars that Americans back home only saw in headlines. Through long months away from family. During all that time, the Carter family business kept growing. My grandfather passed away in 1998, leaving the company primarily under my father's leadership. Government contracts expanded the company rapidly during the early 2000s. Communication satellites. Secure battlefield networks. By the time I reached my 20th year in the Navy, Carter Defense Systems had become a major contractor. I followed the growth from afar. My parents would mention it during phone calls. "Your father signed another Pentagon contract," my mother would say proudly. But I was never deeply involved. My focus remained on service. When I finally retired from the Navy at 59, the transition to civilian life felt strange at first. For 2 decades, my days had been structured by mission briefings and operational schedules. Suddenly, I had quiet mornings. No reports. No classified briefings. Just normal life. That was when my mother called. Her voice sounded tired. "Emily," she said, "your father could use some help at the company." I drove down to Virginia the next week. The headquarters building looked nothing like my grandfather's warehouse. Glass walls. Security checkpoints. Executive offices. But inside, the culture still carried traces of the old days. People who had worked there for decades greeted me warmly. "Your grandfather would be proud," one technician told me during a tour. I believed that too. At least at first. Because once I started reviewing the company's internal reports, something didn't feel right. Certain financial transfers seemed complicated, not illegal exactly, but unnecessarily complex. Funds moving between subsidiary accounts. Contracts routed through unfamiliar financial channels. I brought it up gently during a meeting with the company's chief financial officer. My cousin Daniel. Daniel Carter was 8 years younger than me. He had joined the company during the mid-2000s after finishing an MBA. Polished. Confident. The kind of man who always wore expensive watches. When I asked him about the irregularities, he smiled calmly. "Just normal restructuring," he said. But his explanation felt too rehearsed. Over the next few weeks, I quietly reviewed more documents. Patterns began to emerge. Small inconsistencies. Signatures appearing on digital forms at times when executives were traveling. Approval logs that didn't match internal communications. Nothing that immediately proved fraud, but enough to raise concerns. I started drafting a report. Nothing formal yet, just notes. That's when everything went wrong. 3 months later, my parents called an emergency meeting with the company board. When I walked into that conference room, I expected to discuss financial concerns. Instead, my father slid a thick folder across the table. Inside were documents showing amended trust agreements, ownership transfers, electronic approvals bearing my name. And according to those documents, I had attempted to seize control of nearly $5 billion in company shares. I remember staring at the pages for a long time. Then I said quietly, "These signatures aren't mine." My father didn't answer. My mother just looked down. Daniel sat across the table perfectly still. 2 weeks later, the federal investigation began. And 6 months after that, I was sitting in a Virginia courtroom while my parents testified that I had betrayed them. Back in the present, the bailiff returned through the courtroom doors. "Your Honor," he said, "the witness has arrived." The judge nodded. I took a slow breath. Across the room, Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. And for the first time since the trial began, I noticed a flicker of worry in his eyes. The courtroom doors had closed again after the bailiff's announcement, and the judge decided to address a procedural matter before the witness entered. Lawyers began discussing paperwork quietly at their tables. But my mind had already gone somewhere else. Back to the day everything truly unraveled. Because the accusations against me hadn't come out of nowhere. Someone had planted them. And the man sitting 10 feet behind my parents was the one who had written the lie. Daniel Carter, my cousin. When we were children, Daniel used to spend summers at my grandparents' house in Norfolk. He was quiet back then, observant, always watching how things worked. While I helped Granddad in the warehouse, Daniel preferred sitting in the office where the accounting books were kept. Numbers fascinated him. Balance sheets, profit margins, inventory reports. Even at 16, he could explain things about business that most adults didn't understand. My grandfather used to laugh about it. "Emily builds the equipment," he'd say. "Daniel counts the money." At the time, it sounded harmless. Maybe even complimentary. But people change over time, especially when money gets involved. By the time Daniel joined Carter Defense Systems full-time, the company had already become a major government contractor. His MBA from Georgetown made him an attractive candidate for leadership. Within a few years, he became chief financial officer. The board liked him. Investors trusted him. And my parents believed every word he said. I didn't think much about it while I was still serving overseas. The military teaches you to trust your family, to believe that the people back home are taking care of things while you're gone. But when I returned and began reviewing the company records, the picture didn't add up. The first warning sign came from something simple: a supply contract. One of our subsidiaries had approved a large communications equipment purchase through a third-party logistics company. That wasn't unusual. But the pricing structure didn't make sense. The equipment cost was inflated by almost 12%. 12% might not sound dramatic, but on a contract worth $50 million, that difference mattered. A lot. When I traced the financial flow, the money passed through 2 shell companies before returning to accounts connected with a private investment firm. The firm's managing partner, Daniel Carter. I didn't confront him immediately. 20 years in intelligence had taught me the value of patience. Instead, I began documenting everything quietly. Server logs, transaction histories, email chains, patterns, and the deeper I looked, the clearer it became. Daniel had been siphoning money from the company for years, not in obvious ways, never in amounts large enough to trigger automatic audits, but steadily. Millions here, millions there. Enough to build a fortune without raising suspicion. At least that's what he believed. The real problem for him began when I started asking questions. 3 days after my first conversation with him about the accounting irregularities, something strange happened. My corporate access credentials were suddenly restricted. I couldn't enter certain financial archives anymore. When I asked the IT department, they told me the change came directly from the CFO's office. Daniel. That was when I realized something important. He knew I was getting close. 2 weeks later, the accusations surfaced. Daniel presented my parents with a set of documents: trust amendments, stock transfer authorizations, digital approval forms, all carrying my electronic signature. According to those files, I had attempted to legally transfer controlling ownership of Carter Defense Systems into a trust account under my authority. It was a bold claim, and devastating. My parents didn't understand the technical details of digital signatures or corporate documentation systems. They only saw paperwork that appeared official. Daniel explained it to them calmly. She must have done it after returning from the Navy, he told them. She probably thought no one would notice. By the time I walked into that emergency board meeting, the damage was already done. The federal investigators were contacted the next day. 6 months later, the case reached the courtroom. But Daniel had made one mistake, a mistake that eventually saved me. He assumed the company's external auditor had left the country permanently. Mr. Harold Reynolds had served as Carter Defense Systems' senior compliance auditor for nearly 15 years. A careful man, quiet, methodical. He rarely spoke during meetings unless something truly mattered. 3 months before the accusations against me surfaced, Reynolds had requested extended leave. Daniel told everyone he had accepted a consulting job overseas. Most people believed it, but I didn't. Because 2 weeks after the charges against me were filed, I received a phone call. The number was unfamiliar. The voice on the other end sounded cautious. Ms. Carter? Yes. This is Harold Reynolds. I nearly dropped the phone. Where are you? I asked. Safe, he replied quietly. Then he explained everything. Before leaving the company, he had been conducting a routine compliance review of financial transfers. During that audit, he discovered irregularities connected to shell corporations tied to Daniel. He had begun collecting evidence: server access logs, email records, internal authorization trails. But before he could finalize the report, someone inside the company attempted to erase portions of the financial archive. Daniel. Reynolds realized he was in danger. So he left, quietly, taking copies of the evidence with him. When the accusations against me became public, Reynolds understood exactly what had happened. Daniel had redirected the blame. And now the truth needed to come out. Back in the courtroom, the judge looked toward the bailiff again. Is the witness prepared to enter? Yes, Your Honor. The heavy wooden doors creaked open. Footsteps echoed across the floor. I turned slightly in my chair and saw Harold Reynolds walking toward the witness stand. Across the room, Daniel Carter's face lost its color. Harold Reynolds walked slowly toward the witness stand. He looked older than I remembered. His hair had gone almost completely white, and he leaned slightly on a cane as he moved past the jury box. But his eyes were steady, calm, focused. The kind of eyes you trust when someone is about to tell the truth. Across the courtroom, Daniel shifted in his chair again. Just a small movement. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. But after 21 years working in intelligence, you learn to read people carefully. Daniel was nervous. And that meant something important. The bailiff helped Mr. Reynolds into the witness chair. He raised his right hand and took the oath. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do." His voice was quiet but clear. The judge nodded toward the prosecutor. "You may proceed." The prosecutor stood slowly adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Reynolds," he began, "you previously served as an external compliance auditor for Carter Defense Systems, correct?" "That's correct." "How long did you hold that position?" 15 years. The prosecutor walked a few steps closer to the jury. "And during that time, were you responsible for reviewing corporate financial transactions and internal authorization systems?" "Yes." "So you would be familiar with the company's digital approval process for ownership documents?" "Very familiar." The prosecutor turned slightly and gestured toward the stack of evidence already presented during the trial. "Mr. Reynolds, you have reviewed the documents submitted by the prosecution." "I have." "And in your professional opinion, do those documents show that Emily Carter authorized the transfer of company shares into a trust under her control?" Reynolds paused. The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward. "Yes," he said slowly. "They appear to." A faint murmur passed through the jury box. The prosecutor nodded with quiet satisfaction. "No further questions." My lawyer stood immediately. "Your Honor, permission to cross-examine." "Proceed." He approached the witness stand calmly. "Mr. Reynolds, during your 15 years as auditor, did you ever personally observe Ms. Carter manipulating corporate records?" "Number?" "Did you ever receive any complaints regarding her conduct prior to these allegations?" "Number?" My lawyer nodded. "Now, Mr. Reynolds, you took an unexpected leave from the company shortly before these accusations surfaced, correct?" "Yes." "Why?" Reynolds folded his hands together. "Because I discovered something concerning during an audit." "What did you discover?" The courtroom grew silent again. Reynolds turned his head slightly, looking directly toward the jury. "I discovered a pattern of unauthorized financial transfers involving shell corporations." My lawyer waited. "Who controlled those corporations?" Reynolds inhaled slowly. "Daniel Carter." Across the courtroom, Daniel's chair scraped slightly against the floor. The prosecutor stood up quickly. "Objection, Your Honor." "On what grounds?" "Speculation." My lawyer responded immediately. "The witness is presenting findings from an official audit." The judge considered the objection for a moment. "Overruled. The witness may continue." Reynolds nodded. "Over the course of 2 years, I traced several financial transfers through intermediary corporations connected to Mr. Carter. These transfers diverted company funds into accounts under his control." The jury members exchanged glances. Some began writing notes. My lawyer spoke again. "Mr. Reynolds, did your investigation uncover anything related to the ownership transfer documents presented in this trial?" "Yes." "What did you find?" Reynolds looked directly at the judge. "I found evidence that the digital authorization trail attached to those documents had been manipulated." The prosecutor's expression tightened. "How so?" my lawyer asked. "The system logs showed that the authorization credentials used to approve those documents were accessed remotely." "From where?" Reynolds reached into a folder beside the witness stand and removed a printed report. "The IP address traced back to a private server registered under Daniel Carter's financial consulting firm." The courtroom erupted in quiet whispers. The judge struck the gavel once. "Order." My lawyer continued. "Mr. Reynolds, based on your audit findings, is it possible that someone other than Emily Carter created those authorization records?" "Yes," Reynolds said calmly. "In fact, the evidence strongly suggests that Ms. Carter's credentials were copied and used without her knowledge." The prosecutor stood again. "Your Honor, we request a brief recess." The judge looked down at the documents now being handed to the court clerk. Then he shook his head slightly. "No, I believe the court would benefit from hearing the remainder of the testimony." My lawyer nodded. "One final question, Mr. Reynolds." He gestured toward the defense table where I sat quietly. Based on the financial records you examined, did Emily Carter personally receive any money from the alleged ownership transfer? Number. Did she attempt to sell any company shares? Number. Did she benefit financially in any way from the documents presented by the prosecution? Number. My lawyer turned toward the jury. No further questions. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair. Across the courtroom, Daniel's attorney whispered something urgently to him. But it didn't matter anymore, because the truth was beginning to surface. Slowly. Carefully. Exactly the way it should. For the first time since the trial began, several members of the jury looked at me differently. Not with suspicion, but with curiosity, and maybe even doubt. My parents sat frozen in their seats. My mother's eyes moved between Reynolds and Daniel, trying to understand, trying to reconcile what she had believed with what she was hearing now. The judge tapped his pen lightly on the bench. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, "please submit your audit report to the court." The documents were handed to the clerk. The judge reviewed the first few pages carefully. Then he looked toward the prosecution table. "Counsel," he said evenly, "it appears the direction of this case may require further examination." Across the room, Daniel Carter finally looked at me. For months he had avoided my gaze. But now his eyes met mine. And in that moment, the confidence he once carried was gone, replaced by something else. Fear. When fear finally appeared on Daniel's face, it was subtle. Most people in the courtroom probably didn't notice it. His posture was still straight, his suit still perfectly pressed. But the confidence he had carried for months, the quiet certainty that his story would hold, had cracked. And once cracks appear, the truth has a way of finding its way through. The judge studied the audit report for a few moments longer. The room remained completely silent. Then he looked up. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, "the court would like clarification regarding the digital authorization records referenced in your report." Reynolds adjusted his glasses. "Yes, Your Honor. Please explain how those records could have been manipulated." Reynolds nodded. "The company uses a secure digital authorization system for high-level transactions," he began. "Executives have encrypted credentials that allow them to approve financial and legal documents remotely." The judge leaned slightly forward. "And those credentials were used in this case?" "Yes. But you believe they were used improperly." Reynolds folded his hands together calmly. "Yes, Your Honor. The records show that Ms. Carter's credentials were accessed from a remote server that was not part of the company's internal network." The judge tapped his pen again. "And whose server was it?" Reynolds didn't hesitate. "Daniel Carter's consulting firm." Another quiet wave of murmurs moved through the courtroom. The judge struck the gavel lightly. "Order." The prosecutor stood slowly. "Your Honor, the government requests permission to review this new evidence before proceeding further." The judge nodded. "Granted." There was a short pause while attorneys moved toward the bench. I sat quietly at the defense table watching my parents. My father's shoulders had stiffened. My mother looked pale. For months they had believed Daniel's explanation, that I had tried to manipulate the company, that I had forged documents, that I had betrayed our family. And now that certainty was beginning to collapse. I didn't feel satisfaction. Not the way people might expect in a revenge story. What I felt instead was something heavier. Sadness. Because the real damage wasn't the accusation. It was the distance that had grown between us. After several minutes, the attorneys returned to their tables. The judge looked toward Reynolds again. "Mr. Reynolds, your report indicates you collected additional evidence before leaving the company. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "What kind of evidence?" "Server access logs, internal communications, security records." The judge nodded toward the bailiff. "Please present the materials." Reynolds opened a small briefcase beside the witness stand. Inside were several folders and a portable hard drive. The bailiff carried them to the clerk's desk. Reynolds spoke again. 2 months before the accusations against Ms. Carter appeared, I discovered irregular financial transfers linked to companies controlled by Mr. Daniel Carter. Daniel's attorney immediately stood. "Objection." "State your grounds," the judge replied. "Relevance." My lawyer responded calmly. "The testimony directly relates to the origin of the forged documents." The judge nodded. "Overruled." Reynolds continued. The transfers were structured in a way designed to avoid internal audit thresholds. He opened one of the folders. However, when I examined the authorization logs, I noticed something unusual. What was that? My lawyer asked. Multiple financial approvals had been executed using Ms. Carter's credentials, while she was physically located in another state. The jury began writing notes again. One older gentleman in the front row adjusted his glasses and studied Reynolds carefully. My lawyer stepped closer to the witness stand. Mr. Reynolds, were you able to determine how those credentials were accessed? Yes. How? Through a mirrored login server. The judge frowned slightly. Explain that in simpler terms. Reynolds nodded respectfully. A mirrored server allows someone to imitate the digital identity of another user. In this case, Ms. Carter's credentials were copied. And who had access to create such a system, the judge asked. Reynolds turned slowly, looking directly at Daniel. Mr. Carter did. The silence in the courtroom felt heavier this time. Daniel shifted again in his chair. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently. But the damage had already been done. My lawyer asked one final question. Mr. Reynolds, did Ms. Carter receive any personal benefit from the documents presented in this trial? Number. Did she authorize the transfer of company shares? Number. Based on your findings, who created the fraudulent authorization trail? Reynolds answered without hesitation. Daniel Carter. The courtroom doors suddenly opened again. 2 federal investigators stepped inside quietly. They approached the prosecution table and spoke briefly with the lead prosecutor. The prosecutor's expression changed almost immediately. He stood. Your Honor. The judge looked up. Yes. Based on the new evidence presented by the witness and information provided by federal investigators, the government requests permission to amend the direction of this case. The judge leaned back slightly. In what way? The prosecutor glanced toward Daniel. We believe the court should consider the possibility that Mr. Daniel Carter may be responsible for the fraudulent activity originally attributed to Ms. Carter. Daniel stood up suddenly. That's ridiculous, he said. His voice was sharper now. Less controlled. My cousin's been manipulating this company for months. Sit down, Mr. Carter, the judge interrupted firmly. Daniel hesitated. But he sat. The judge looked at the federal investigators now standing near the door. Gentlemen, he said calmly, do you have something to add? One of them stepped forward. Yes, Your Honor. He held up a thin folder. This morning we obtained additional financial records connected to Mr. Carter's private investment firm. The judge nodded. Please present them. As the documents were handed to the clerk, the judge turned toward the jury. Members of the jury, he said evenly, this court will take a short recess while the new evidence is reviewed. The gavel struck once. People began standing. Whispers filled the room. Across the courtroom, my mother finally looked directly at me. Her eyes were wet, confused, and filled with something else too. Regret. The courtroom emptied slowly during the recess. Jurors were escorted out first, led quietly by the bailiff. Attorneys gathered their papers. Reporters whispered to one another near the hallway doors. I stayed seated. 21 years in the Navy had taught me something important about moments like this. When everything around you starts moving quickly, the best thing you can do is stay still. Across the room, Daniel stood beside his attorney, speaking in tense, hurried whispers. His composure had vanished completely now. The polished executive confidence he used to wear like armor had cracked wide open. I watched him for a moment. Not with anger. Just with a strange kind of clarity. Daniel had always been ambitious. Even as kids, you could see it in the way he watched people studying them, calculating what they knew, what they had. My grandfather used to say ambition was a useful thing as long as it stayed honest. Somewhere along the way, Daniel had lost that boundary. The courtroom doors opened again. The bailiff called everyone back inside. Court is now back in session. People returned to their seats. The jurors came in quietly, avoiding eye contact with the attorneys. The judge took his place behind the bench and adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the new evidence that had been placed before him. The room settled into silence. Finally, he looked up. After reviewing the materials submitted during the recess, he said the court has serious concerns regarding the authenticity of the financial records previously presented against Ms. Carter. A quiet ripple moved through the room. The judge continued. Evidence provided by Mr. Reynolds and the federal investigators indicates that the digital authorization logs associated with the alleged share transfer may have been falsified. He paused. Then his gaze shifted toward Daniel. Specifically, the records suggest unauthorized use of Ms. Carter's credentials through an external mirrored server. Daniel's attorney stood quickly. Your Honor. Sit down, counselor. The judge's voice was calm but firm. This court is not finished. Daniel slowly lowered himself back into his chair. The judge turned toward the prosecution. Given the new evidence, does the government intend to proceed with the charges against Ms. Carter? The prosecutor stood. For the first time since the trial began, his tone had changed. Your Honor, based on the information now available, the government believes the charges against Ms. Carter should be dismissed. My lawyer exhaled quietly beside me. The judge nodded once. So ordered. He lifted the gavel. Charges against Emily Carter are hereby dismissed. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom. Just like that. 6 months of accusations, gone in a single moment. But the judge wasn't finished. He looked toward the federal investigators again. Gentlemen, he said, if you wish to pursue further investigation regarding Mr. Daniel Carter, this court will cooperate fully. One of the investigators nodded. Daniel stood abruptly. This is insane, he said, his voice cracking slightly. You can't just turn this around on me. But no one responded, because the truth was already standing in the open. The investigators approached him calmly. Mr. Carter, one of them said quietly, we'd like to ask you a few questions. Daniel looked around the courtroom. For a moment his eyes met mine again. But there was no confidence left there now. Only disbelief. And fear. They escorted him out through the side door. The room fell silent again. The judge gathered his papers. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck one final time. People began leaving. But I remained seated. Because there was still something I needed to face. Slowly my parents stood from their bench. They hesitated. Then they walked toward me. My father looked older than he had that morning. His shoulders seemed heavier somehow. My mother held his arm as they approached the defense table. For a moment none of us spoke. Finally my father cleared his throat. Emily. His voice faltered. We didn't know. I studied his face carefully. The man who taught me discipline. The man who stood proudly when I graduated from Navy officer training. Now he looked like someone carrying a weight he couldn't put down. We thought you betrayed us, he said quietly. My mother wiped at her eyes. Daniel showed us the documents, she said. They looked real. I nodded slowly. I know. There was no anger left in me. Anger had burned away months earlier. All that remained was something quieter. Understanding. Because my parents hadn't tried to destroy me. They had been frightened. Confused. Manipulated. And time had made things worse. 20 years of my military career had kept me away from home more than I realized. Distance has a way of creating silence. And silence gives lies room to grow. My father looked down at the floor. I should have called you first, he said, before going to the investigators. Maybe, I replied gently. He looked up again. You're not angry. I thought about that for a moment. Then I shook my head. Number. Because the truth was simple. Family mistakes hurt. But they also reveal something important. Whether people are willing to face the truth once it appears. My mother reached out and took my hand. We're so sorry, Emily. Her voice trembled. For a moment the courtroom faded around us. The reporters. The lawyers. The jurors gathering their belongings. None of it mattered. I squeezed her hand gently. It's over, I said. But even as I spoke the words, I knew something else remained ahead. Because justice had only solved the legal problem. Healing the family would take a little longer. The courthouse hallway was quieter than I expected. Most of the reporters had already rushed outside to chase the larger story Daniel Carter, the financial scandal, the federal investigation that would likely follow. But I wasn't thinking about headlines. At 62 years old, you begin to understand something about life. The loudest moments aren't always the ones that matter most. Sometimes it's the quiet ones that stay with you. My parents and I walked slowly down the long hallway together. The old courthouse floors creaked beneath our steps the way old buildings always do. For a few minutes, none of us spoke. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon sun had begun to sink lower in the sky. The trees across the street were turning that deep orange color you only see in Virginia during early fall. Finally, my father stopped walking. "Emily," he said. His voice sounded tired. I turned to face him. For a moment, he just stood there studying my face as if trying to understand the daughter he thought he had lost. "I should have trusted you," he said quietly. Those words carried more weight than the entire trial. I could see the regret in his eyes. And something else, too. Fear. Not fear of the law or the investigation. Fear that maybe the damage between us couldn't be repaired. My mother stepped closer. "We let someone come between us," she said softly. "We should have known better." I thought about that. About how easy it is for misunderstandings to grow when people stop talking to each other. My years in the Navy had taught me discipline and patience. But they had also taken me far away from home. Long deployments. Years spent overseas. Missed holidays. Phone calls instead of visits. Looking back, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. Distance creates silence. And silence leaves room for doubt. Daniel had simply stepped into that silence and filled it with lies. "I should have come home more often," I said finally. My father shook his head. "No," he replied firmly. "You served your country. That's something we've always been proud of." For the first time that day, I saw a familiar look return to his face. The same pride he carried when I left for boot camp all those years ago. The same pride he felt when I pinned on my officer's insignia. We stepped outside together. The cool air felt different after hours inside the courtroom. My mother looked toward the parking lot, then back at me. "What happens now?" she asked. I smiled slightly. "Well, I said first I'm going home." "Home where?" my father asked. "Annapolis." My small house near the water suddenly sounded very appealing after the chaos of the past 6 months. He nodded slowly. Then he surprised me. After that, he said, "Maybe you come down for dinner this weekend." The way he said it felt almost shy. Like a man asking permission instead of giving an order. I understood what he was really asking. Not about dinner. About starting again. "I'd like that," I said. My mother squeezed my arm. "Good," she whispered. We stood there together for a moment longer. 3 people who had nearly lost each other. Not because of hatred, but because of fear and misunderstanding. The investigation into Daniel would continue for months. Federal cases take time. There would be hearings, financial audits, and long legal processes. But that part of the story no longer belonged to me. What mattered now was something much simpler. Family. A few weeks later, I drove down to my parents' house for that dinner. The same house where I had grown up. The same porch where my father once taught me how to fix a broken radio antenna. We ate slowly that evening. Simple food. Roast chicken. Green beans. Mashed potatoes. Nothing fancy. But the conversation felt honest. My father admitted something during dessert. "I let the business get too complicated," he said. "I should have asked more questions." I nodded. Most problems start when people stop asking questions. He chuckled softly. "That sounds like something your grandfather would have said." We talked about the company, too. The board had already begun restructuring leadership after the scandal. Professional management would take over daily operations. My parents would finally retire. And me? I had no interest in running a billion-dollar corporation. After 2 decades in military intelligence, I knew what kind of life I wanted. Something quieter. Something honest. A few weeks later, I started volunteering at a local veterans center in Annapolis, helping younger service members transition into civilian life. It felt right. Sometimes they asked me about my past, about the Navy, about intelligence work, about the trial. I usually told them the same thing. Life will test your patience, I'd say. But the truth has a way of showing up eventually. And when it does, you have to decide whether you'll hold on to anger or choose forgiveness. Because revenge may win a moment, but forgiveness rebuilds a lifetime. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone you love, take a moment today and reach out to them. Sometimes a simple conversation can prevent years of misunderstanding. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, one stories about life truth and second chances, feel free to share this story or follow along for the next one. Until then, take care of the people who matter. Because in the end, that's what lasts.